All right. This week, guys, we are going to take a look at how our body protects itself against these different pathogens that we've talked about so far. So far we've looked at, the pathogens themselves. We've taken a look at, how we have medications that help to protect against these pathogens. We've taken a look at epidemiology, so how things are studied and how healthcare facilities, try to protect against these different pathogens. And we've looked at how we diagnose and how then we use these clinical specimens to diagnose these different infections and even the pathogenesis of these different pathogens. So now let's take a look at what we ourselves do. What do our bodies do to protect ourselves? Hopefully this is going to be a review for you all from anatomy, because in anatomy we did cover the immune system. But here, this is just going to be a refresher for us because, again, that's what we're looking at here. We're looking at our immune system and how our body protects against all of these infectious diseases. So here today, right now, we're going to take a look first at chapter 15. So chapter 15, we're looking at, we're going to look at two different things today. We're going to take a look at chapter 15, which is going to be our body's non-specific host defense mechanisms, and I'll explain that. And then in 16, we'll take a look at our specific host defense mechanisms, and I'll explain that. Let's do that right now. So introduction here, or I'm sorry, an outline for today. We're going to look at introduction. We're going to take a look at what I mean by non-specific host defense mechanisms and what they are. So this chapter is going to focus on the first and second line of defense. So here's our introduction, is explaining that very thing, that we have, our body is filled with different defenses. We have our so we ourselves as the potential host, our defense mechanisms are ways in which we protect the body from pathogens. It's referred to as the 3 lines of defense. So we have 3 lines. The first 2 are called non-specific, which means it's not specific to any one particular type of pathogen. It's not only targeting the flu or only targeting chickenpox or only targeting polio. That's where our immune system is going to come in later, or vaccines and things of that nature. We'll touch on that in chapter 16, where that's going to be specific, only specifically looking for, one particular type of, or one particular strain of a certain pathogen to fight that off. Our non-specific means that anything that doesn't belong in our body, we are going to do everything in our power to keep that out of our body or to at least fight it off. So that's what we're going to look at today in this chapter as we take a look at our first 2 lines of defense. So again, our third line is going to be the immune response, and that's going to be very specific. The third line of defense, what happens is we have special proteins that we create called antibodies in response to these foreign invaders called antigens. If you remember from anatomy, we termed those antigens. It just means anything that's foreign, whether it's an infectious pathogen or anything that doesn't belong. That could even be dust and debris and things of that nature. But specifically, yes, pathogen. So that's kind of a synonym to pathogen, meaning an infectious agent that gets into our body. We create antibodies in response to those, and we create antibodies that are very specific to those types of antigens. So we'll look at that in chapter 16. So a more visual example here, again, if this is a big scary pathogen trying to make its way into our body, it first has to get through our first line of defense, which is going to include things like our skin and our physical barriers. We're going to then, if it does make its way into our body, we're going to then see our second line of defense, which would include our phagocytes. Remember our white blood cells that we have that are just eating anything that doesn't belong. We're going to talk about that. Inflammation, fever, things of that nature. And then if it makes its way through those mechanisms, then it is going to run into the third line of defense, which is going to be dependent on either exposure to that pathogen already, or again, a vaccine to that pathogen. It's going to be very dependent on, what our immune system looks like. All right, so just again, another breakdown of our host defense mechanisms. We have non-specific and specific. Our non-specific host defense mechanisms are going to include our first and second line of defense, which we'll look at in this chapter. And then our specific is going to be the third. We'll see in chapter 16. So our non-specific host defense mechanisms are general They serve to protect the body against many different types of harmful substances. Sometimes it's referred to as innate or inborn resistance. Some people even refer to it as natural. Exact factors that produce this innate resistance are not completely well understood, but that's what we're looking at here. A lot of times we are born with these non-specific host defense mechanisms, and a lot of them we are familiar with, and we can talk about that today. So other non-specific host defense mechanisms include mechanical and physical barriers to our invasion. So again, I mentioned like the skin, for instance, chemical factors, which would include any type of chemical present in our body that's working to either destroy, or I'll give you an example, like there's a enzyme in our saliva that is used to help break down food. It's called lipase, and that particular enzyme is going to work. We've got all kinds of different enzymes in our body: lipase, amylase, just enzymes. Anytime you see the word ace at the end of it, it's some type of enzyme. And an enzyme itself is really, if we were to just define the word enzyme, it is a chemical that is used to help speed up a chemical reaction. In digestion, that chemical reaction is the breaking down of our food particles. And that happens as soon as we put food into our mouth with our saliva. So that chemical that's present in our saliva helps to break down that food. However, if we have any pathogens present in that food, that chemical may also help to break it down as well and help destroy it before it enters into, further into our body. So there's different chemicals that are present in the very beginning parts of our body. There's chemicals present in our skin, on our indigenous microflora that's present in our skin. We also have different chemicals present in things like sweat. So then when other pathogens make its way onto our skin, not only are indigenous microflora working to fight that off, but we have different chemicals that may help as well. So microbial antagonism, I just mentioned that indigenous microflora that is, normally in that, system of the body, or again, I used the example on my skin, or on that system of the body, are going to work to fight off those invaders. Fever, inflammatory response, and our phagocytic white blood cells. All of these things we're going to touch on in a little bit more detail, but again, they're non-specific. All of these things are just targeting whatever doesn't belong. We're going to try to get rid of it. So our first line of defense mostly includes our skin and mucous membranes as those physical barriers. That we have our skin, that as long as there's no cut in our skin, there's no opening in our skin, anything that lands on the surface of our skin typically is not going to make its way into our body until I maybe, wipe my nose or lick it or something, then in that case, then it's making its way into my nose or into my mouth. So typically our skin is that kind of suit of armor. Mucous membranes work the same way. That mucous membranes that line like the inner lining of our respiratory system, like inside our nose, most of our anatomical systems that are open to the outside are lined with a mucous membrane. So that includes our urinary tract, our genital tract. We've got even our nose and our mouth. All of these systems are open to the outside. So a way to protect that, because there's not that skin that's there to stop anything from entering into that opening. If things do get into that opening, mucous membranes are going to try to trap anything that comes in and help to try and destroy with chemicals that are sometimes present in that mucus. But I'll give you the example, like if we breathe something into our nose, oftentimes that mucus will trap, and our attempt is to try and make sure that we either blow it out, or if it gets further into our respiratory system, we also have cilia, which are those tiny hairs that line the respiratory tract. They're going to work to try and sweep that towards the pharynx so that we end up swallowing it with saliva and mucus, and then it makes its way to our digestive system, which is hopefully going to be destroyed in the chemicals, as we talk about other chemical factors in our stomach. So other cellular and chemical factors that we come across, in addition to the skin as a physical barrier, there are other factors: the pH and temperature of skin, just our temperature of our body itself, perspiration. So there's, again, sweat. We know the job of sweat is to cool us off. But if pathogens happen to be present in our sweat, remember when sweat evaporates, that's the process of cooling ourselves off, because the heat is leaving our body. But hopefully then the pathogens are leaving our body as well in that evaporation process. Cilia, I just mentioned, working to try and get things towards the stomach so that we can then run into stomach acids and things of that nature. Various enzymes and secretions such as lysozyme. And again, any other enzyme. Enzymes are chemicals that are going to help to, help to speed up that reaction and break that down, break down those pathogens that could be present. And those are all part of the first line of defense. And again, microbial antagonism. So when indigenous microflora are going to stop the colonization of any new arrivals, they work to, the reason why they do that is because, again, indigenous microflora live in these body systems or on our skin, for instance. They belong there. So if new arrivals come, they're going to compete for sites and for nutrients, and and production of lethal substances to eliminate those new arrivals, so those new pathogens. So they're going to fight those off for us as well. So that's our first line of defense. Our second line of defense includes a little bit more. So we are now talking about these pathogens have made its way past our first line, so past our skin and these mucous membranes. Those chemicals maybe didn't work as well as we'd hoped. So now we get into the second line of defense. So we have a couple different things. We have transferins. This is a glycoprotein that is in our body that will then, in response to some type of systemic bacterial infection, it will increase. What it does is it binds to iron. So iron within our body. Bacteria can sometimes be very dependent on iron as a nutrient that's going to help it to spread. But by binding to iron, these transferins are going to deprive the pathogen of that vital nutrient, therefore killing off the pathogen. So it doesn't even, its job isn't even to approach the pathogen itself, that bacteria. Instead, it is going to work to hold on to a nutrient. It's like taking away its, what it needs for life. It's hoarding that particular nutrient to make sure that bacteria doesn't get it. So that's what transferins do. So it's a particular type of glycoprotein in our body that will work to deprive bacteria of iron. We also have fever. I know all of us have probably experienced fever at some point in our lives, or our kids have. Fever is stimulated by pyrogenic, which simply means fever-producing substances, or pathogens. What this does is it augments the host defenses by stimulating leukocytes, which, remember, is a type of white blood cell, is our white blood cells. And this reduces our free plasma iron. Another goal of fever is to increase our body temperature. We talked about, part of our skin is the temperature of our skin. But now that pathogen is now into our body, we can do the same thing with temperature. That as we increase the temperature of our body, what it's doing is it's working to kill off, because some pathogens can't reach that high temperature. And that's important. So oftentimes fever, we don't want to reduce a person's fever or patient. We don't want to reduce their fever immediately, because sometimes that fever simply means that their body is fighting off that infection. Obviously, after a long period of time, we don't want to have a patient that has experienced a fever for too long, or even if a fever reaches a certain temperature, we don't want that temperature to get to a too high of a level. But a small fever sometimes can be left alone, because it just means that their body is fighting off an infection, and we want to let it do that. We want to let it, run that course. Interferons are also very similar to transferins, which are just part of our body. Interferons are very similar. These are proteins. Instead of being antibacterial like transferins are, these are antiviral. So proteins in our body, they're actually created. They're not already in our body. These are actually produced by virus-infected cells. So the virus, the cell that has been infected by a virus, remember, viruses infect a host cell and then use that host cell against itself. But that host cell can actually recognize that it's been infected by a virus, and it creates these proteins called interferons. And its job is to prevent that virus from spreading even more. It knows that it's been infected, but it's trying to protect other host cells from being infected. So it tries to stop that multiplication. So that's what an interferon is. It's an antiviral protein that is created by these virus-infected cells to keep the viruses from multiplying. And I tell you what, guys, you all do not need to worry that there are 3 different types. So don't worry about the different alpha, beta, and gamma. But do know that they are not virus specific. that they are, again, targeting, they're strictly targeting viruses. So not bacteria, not fungi, but they're not worried. It's not just one particular type of virus. Okay. All right. So interferons. Inflammation is another one. The body responds to any type of local injury, irritation, or even a microbial invasion or bacterial toxin by a complex series of events referred to as inflammation. So I'm sure we've experienced inflammation before. So when I say a local injury, say a cut on our skin, sometimes it swells up a little bit and we see that, or an irritation like a rash of some sort. Or again, we just have an infection, so a microbial invasion or a bacterial toxin. What happens is we see that swelling and that redness, and that's what we're typically seeing. We'll talk about symptoms in just a second. But when we see that inflammation, here's what's happening. One, the purpose of inflammation is increasing the diameter. So again, the width of these capillaries. So we call that vasodilation. And this increases the blood flow directly to that site. So let's say in the event that I get a splinter in my skin. So maybe it's a pretty decent sized splinter. We may see a little bit of swelling around that splinter. I'm just kind of pointing to my wrist here. Say if I got a splinter in my wrist. So again, we're increasing blood flow to that site. What that's going to do, it's also, that increased permeability of the capillaries, meaning that it's going to open up the capillaries even more, allowing the escape of plasma and plasma proteins, which are going to help in a number of different ways. There's a couple different things, or a couple different plasma proteins that we have, and they're going to work to either help clot the skin if we have a cut in our skin, help to, bring leukocytes. We'll talk about the white blood cells. And so there's a number of different things that plasma is going to do to help heal that site. But the exit of those leukocytes from those capillaries also help because, again, our white blood cells, remember, are our body's defenders, or our blood's defenders, and it's going to work to fight off any infection that could be present around that splinter. So the primary purpose of this is to localize the infection, to make sure that we're not spreading that infection throughout the body, that it stays right there at that site to prevent the spread of those microbial invaders. Help neutralize any toxins that could be present at the site. We want to try to get those down so that, again, there's no harm done, and then aid in the repair of any damaged tissue. So like I said, sometimes if a clot has to take place, or again, just, repair anything at that site. The four major signs and symptoms of inflammation are redness, heat, swelling, and pain. I'm sure we've all kind of seen inflammation before, where we see a little bit of that swelling and we see the redness and heat that we feel at that site. Okay, and don't worry about the plasma that escapes from capillaries. I don't have anything on that. Just know that that's the biggest thing that we'll see with inflammation, and that's why we see inflammation. So here again is our symptoms, and again, that we see kind of visually here, that swelling, we see some redness, heat, and pain. And again, the purpose is to localize and prevent the spread of pathogens, help destroy and detoxify those pathogens, and then repair. All right. So sometimes we even see, and you guys may be familiar with this, we see a little bit more at the site of inflammation. Sometimes we see an accumulation of fluid, maybe sometimes cells and cellular debris, at this inflammation site. This is known as inflammatory exudate. Exudate can sometimes be thick and produce kind of a greenish yellowy color. And this is what we know as pus, or purulent exudate. Pus is like I said, it's kind of thick, greenish yellowish. It contains live and dead leukocytes, those white blood cells that have accumulated at that site. Doesn't always necessarily mean an infection is present. It just means that, again, the escape of these live and dead leukocytes. Sometimes we want to make sure that we are watching it, though, to make sure that it doesn't continue for a long time, because it could be that the infection is trying to make its way out and it's having a hard time. So in many inflammatory responses, such as with arthritis or pancreatitis, there is no exudate and no invading microorganisms. Somebody with arthritis may have swelling in their fingers, but it doesn't mean that there's a pathogen present. They're just seeing that same inflammatory response, to that particular disease. Phagocytosis is another part of our second line of defense. Again, our phagocytic white blood cells, or also known as phagocytes, these are the cells that are white blood cells that surround and engulf and then ingest these foreign materials, and that process is called phagocytosis. So remember that we talked about those. They're a type of white blood cell or a type of leukocyte in our blood. Those phagocytes destroy by eating. You do not need to know again, we talked about this in anatomy, so you guys may be familiar with the categories of our white blood cells, but don't worry about that. We already talked about that. The main thing I want you guys to know for this is that phagocytosis itself is part of our second line of defense. And again, know what a phagocyte is, that particular type of white blood cell that destroys by eating. And again, it's part of our second line of defense, which means it's not specifically targeting one type of pathogen. Anything that doesn't belong, the phagocyte is going to destroy. Okay. And there's just the different elements of our blood there. And you can see here are our white blood cells. And then again, there are a couple of them that were phagocytes, but don't have to worry about those. This process just shows this picture. You don't have to know the steps in phagocytosis, but I'm going to show you what I mean by how they engulf and then ingest a pathogen. So here we have this yellow as a phagocyte. This little purple guy right here is a bacterial cell. You can see that this phagocyte slowly gets, comes up on the bacteria, will surround that bacteria. Now, next slide here, you can see what it does. It produces, there's a lot more steps, like I said, involved in this process of phagocytosis, but again, it eventually will break it down. It digests that bacterial cell, stopping the bacterial cell from causing any harm to the host. And there's just a microscopic image of the same thing. Okay, so what are some ways that pathogens sometimes escape phagocytosis? Well, one, we've talked about how capsules, some bacterial cells contain capsules. They serve to protect the organism from this phagocytosis. It serves as an anti-phagocytic function, which means that it's going to make sure that it doesn't get surrounded and engulfed. It may still get surrounded, but that capsule kind of acts like a shell around that bacteria and protects it. Some bacteria will produce an exoenzyme called leukocidin, and that's going to actually kill the phagocyte itself, so the phagocyte can't do its job. Some bacteria are just not destroyed. They're the particular bacteria, for whatever reason, just will not be destroyed. And the mechanism by which each pathogen evades this digestion by these lysosomal enzymes differs from pathogen to pathogen and is really not completely yet understood. So that's why we're continually studying these. But these are, again, a couple different reasons why certain pathogens can escape that destruction. Okay. And additional factors that can impair host defense mechanisms. We know that, again, the idea is that, a patient, hopefully, the healthier the better, and their age is a big thing too. But these are all things that can impair their ability to fight off any of these invaders. So their nutritional status, their increased iron levels, stress, as we talked about how iron can sometimes be an important nutrient for bacteria. Stress, the more stressed we are, sometimes our immune system is a little bit weaker with that. Cancer and cancer chemotherapy both can weaken the immune system. Various genetic defects, sometimes people are just genetically predisposed to certain things and sometimes can't fight off certain things because of their genes. Age, again, those that are elderly, their immune system is weaker, and then newborns and infants haven't developed their immune system yet. So age is a big factor. AIDS as well, so remember the immunodeficiency syndrome, so that a patient with AIDS definitely going to have a weakened immune system. And then drugs, sometimes patients who are on things like steroids, their immune system is weaker because of the medication that they're taking. So these are all things that can weaken that immune system or that ability to fight something off. And so they're more than likely going to get sick from this pathogen. All right. So short and sweet chapter there. That's chapter 15. Again, we were taking a look at just our very non-specific host defense mechanisms, ways in which the body really defends itself against anything that doesn't belong, any type of foreign invader. Those are just a few things that we ourselves are going to try and do. In the next chapter, we'll take a look at our specific host defense mechanisms.